The rain poured down with relentless force over the quiet countryside of North Carolina. Thunder rolled in the distance, and heavy drops rattled against the roof of a small wooden cabin that had grown too silent in recent months. Inside, curled beneath an old recliner, Riley, the golden retriever with kind, sorrowful eyes, rested in stillness. Since Colton Reyes had passed away 3 months earlier, Riley had barely moved from that spot, guarding the place where his human used to sit, as if waiting for him to return. Then came the sound, faint at first, a high-pitched cry, not from the wind or the storm, but something alive. Riley's ears perked up. It was a whimper, soft, frightened, desperate. Without hesitation, Riley rose, pushed the door open with his nose, and stepped into the storm. Rain soaked his fur immediately as he followed the cry to the edge of the fence. Beneath a tangled bush, nearly invisible in the dark, lay a tiny kitten, wet, shivering, barely breathing. Riley gently picked up the kitten in his mouth, careful not to hurt him, and carried him back inside. The house smelled of wet fur and old wood as Riley placed the small creature near the fireplace. He nudged a blue towel off the couch and covered the kitten with it, licking his tiny head with the tenderness of a mother. The kitten, Oscar, let out one final weak cry before curling into a ball. Riley lay beside him, watching over him with unwavering attention. The next morning, Ellery Voss arrived with a fresh loaf of sourdough and her usual soft knock. She had been checking on Riley ever since Colton's passing. When she stepped inside, she froze. Riley didn't even look up. His body was wrapped around the kitten, who peeked out from beneath the towel with wide, frightened eyes. Ellery stepped closer and reached down, but Riley let out a low, protective growl. Not out of anger, out of something deeper, possessiveness, grief, love. Ellery stepped back slowly and sat in Colton's old recliner, still marked by time and loneliness. Her eyes drifted to the wall where a dusty photograph hung. Colton, much younger, beside a woman holding a baby. He always said it was just a cousin visiting, nothing important. But now, with Riley guarding that fragile kitten like his life depended on it, Ellery's heart whispered otherwise. Something about the way Riley clung to that kitten. It wasn't just instinct. It was memory, pain, maybe even redemption. And deep inside, Ellery knew this wasn't a random rescue. It was the beginning of something much bigger, something that Colton had left behind, and Riley had not forgotten. The storm had passed, but the chill lingered. The trees outside were still dripping, and the ground around the cabin had turned to thick mud. Inside, Riley hadn't moved from his spot. Oscar slept curled under the blue towel, his small chest rising and falling with fragile rhythm. Ellery stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, eyes locked on the two of them. Something about the way Riley guarded the kitten stirred a memory she couldn't place, like a familiar melody just out of reach. She knew dogs could grieve, but this wasn't grief. This was something deeper, more purposeful. She spent the rest of the morning tidying the cabin, careful not to disturb them. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon and pine, the way Colton liked it. On the bookshelf near the window, Ellery found a worn leather journal. She hesitated before opening it, but curiosity overcame her. Inside, Colton had scribbled notes, mostly observations about birds, weather, and gardening. But on the last page, in faded ink, was a name, Maverick Shaw. There was no context, just the name, underlined twice. Ellery blinked, heart racing. She'd never heard Colton mention a Maverick before. Riley stirred as she closed the journal, his eyes following her movements like he understood more than he should. When Ellery knelt to refill Oscar's dish with warm milk, Riley didn't growl this time. Instead, he placed a paw gently over the towel, anchoring Oscar in place as if afraid the kitten would disappear. Ellery sat beside them on the floor, silence pressing between them like a heavy quilt. "Did he remind you of someone?" she whispered, not really expecting an answer. Riley didn't move, but his eyes glistened with something ancient. Recognition, pain, a memory held tight in his chest. Later that afternoon, Ellery drove into town. She visited the local vet clinic where she'd taken her own pets for years. Dr. Jasper Quinn greeted her with a warm smile, his sleeves rolled up and stethoscope dangling from his neck. When she explained the situation, an elderly dog refusing to leave a rescued kitten, his expression turned thoughtful. "Animals remember things, Ellery," he said, tapping his pen against a clipboard. "Sometimes better than we do, especially when the bond goes deeper than just the present moment." She left the clinic with more questions than answers, and a growing ache in her chest. By the time she returned to the cabin, the sun was beginning to set. The light stretched long and golden through the windows, casting a soft glow over Riley and Oscar. The dog hadn't eaten all day, neither had he slept much. But when Ellery entered the room, Riley lifted his head and nudged the kitten closer to her. For the first time, it felt like he was asking for help. Not for himself, but for the little life he was trying to protect. And in that quiet, Ellery knew this wasn't just about Oscar. This was about Colton, and something Riley couldn't say, but desperately needed someone to uncover. That night, Ellery couldn't sleep. The name Maverick Shaw circled her thoughts like a ghost. It wasn't common, not around this town. She sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open, the glow from the screen casting faint shadows across the room. A quick online search pulled up dozens of irrelevant results. Car dealerships, hunters, even a tattoo artist in Arizona. But on the third page, buried beneath junk listings, she found a small, faded obituary from 17 years ago. Maverick Shaw, 28, survived by his infant son. No mention of a mother, no photos, no details, just a name and a date. She leaned back in her chair, heart heavy. Could this be who Colton had written about? And if so, why? The time didn't add up. 17 years ago, Maverick would have been close to Colton's age then. Too old to be a child, too young to be a distant relative. Something wasn't right. As the house creaked and the wind pushed against the windows, Ellery thought of Riley. The way he had reacted to Oscar, the devotion, the grief. It wasn't just protection. It was as if Riley believed Oscar mattered in a way no one else could see. Back at the cabin the next morning, Ellery brought a thermos of coffee and a small tin of chicken broth for Riley, hoping he'd finally eat. He sniffed it but didn't touch it. Instead, he walked in slow, nervous circles around the kitten. Oscar had begun to move more, his tiny legs unsteady but curious. He followed Riley with uncoordinated steps, like a shadow learning how to exist. Every time he meowed, Riley responded with a soft whine, as if the sounds were familiar, too familiar. Ellery sat on the floor, notebook in hand. She jotted down everything. The date she found Oscar, Colton's old journal entries, Riley's reactions, the name Maverick Shaw. The more she tried to make sense of it, the more the pieces felt like part of a puzzle she didn't have the edges for. What would drive a man like Colton, quiet, private, cautious, to write a name so cryptically? And why would his dog bond with a kitten so fiercely, so unnaturally? She made a call to Silas Drayton, an old family friend and retired social worker who had worked in child placement services decades ago. If anyone knew about Maverick or could access old records, it was Silas. "That's not a name I hear often," he said slowly over the phone. "But it does ring a bell. Give me a day or two. I'll see what I can dig up." The way he said it sent a chill down her back. Not fear, but anticipation. As evening fell again, Oscar curled up against Riley's chest, safe beneath the dog's chin. Riley didn't sleep. He just stared at the door, eyes wide, as if waiting for something, or someone. And Ellery, watching them both, felt it too. They weren't just remembering. They were expecting. 2 days later, Ellery's phone rang just as she was stepping out of the shower. The caller ID read Silas Drayton, and her heart skipped. She wrapped a towel around her and answered quickly, notebook already in hand. "I found something," Silas said, his voice low and deliberate. Maverick Shaw was in the foster system as a child. He bounced around several homes, eventually aged out, had some minor trouble with the law in his early 20s. Then nothing, until his obituary. But here's where it gets strange. Ellery leaned in, every muscle tense. At age 18, Maverick filed a request to unseal his birth records. The name listed under father? Colton Reyes. Ellery stood frozen in the middle of her kitchen. Her breath caught in her throat. Colton had a son? She whispered, more to herself than to Silas. It made no sense. Colton had lived alone for decades. Never mentioned a child. Never even hinted at it. Do you have proof of that? She asked. I have a scanned copy of the record. I'll email it to you, Silas replied. I also found something else. Maverick's son. The infant mentioned in the obituary? No formal adoption ever took place. No next of kin listed. It's like he vanished. Back at the cabin, Riley had grown restless. He paced constantly, sniffed the windows, and barked softly at shadows. Oscar had gained strength and was now actively following Riley everywhere, batting at his tail and curling against his side. But Riley wasn't just being nurturing, he was anxious, protective in a way that went beyond instinct. Ellery returned just after dusk and found Riley sitting at the door, staring out into the trees. She sat beside him, holding the printed birth record in her lap, hands trembling slightly. I think I understand now, she whispered. Maverick was Colton's son, and Oscar might be Maverick's. She looked at the kitten, who was now chewing playfully on a piece of fabric. And somehow Riley knows. The truth hit her like a wave. Riley had been there when Colton found out. Maybe even when Maverick visited, if he ever did. Maybe he remembered a scent, a face, something locked in his canine memory. And when he heard Oscar crying in the rain, he didn't just hear a kitten. He heard family. The next morning, Ellery visited the town records office. She asked about Maverick's last known address. It had been a small trailer outside a neighboring county, burned down in a fire 6 months ago. Cause? Unknown. No survivors confirmed, but no infant body ever recovered either. Ellery stood in stunned silence. There's more to this, she said aloud, not caring who heard. That kitten wasn't just lost. He was left, or hidden. That night, Riley refused to sleep. He lay by the door again, ears alert, eyes distant. Oscar clung to him, a tiny heartbeat pressed against a guardian who had already lost too much. And Ellery sat at the kitchen table, staring at a map, wondering just how far the truth would take them, and what it might cost to uncover it. The next morning, the air felt different, still and heavy, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Ellery arrived at the cabin early, a bag of groceries in hand, but she could tell something had changed the moment she stepped inside. Riley didn't greet her. Instead, he stood in the hallway, tail still, eyes focused on a closed door at the end, Colton's old study, a room Ellery had never been in. It had always been locked. Until now, the door creaked open with a slow resistance, like it hadn't been touched in years. The room smelled of cedar and dust, with papers scattered on a desk, yellowed maps pinned to the walls, and boxes stacked in the corner, sealed but marked with fading ink. Riley stepped inside first, slowly, nose twitching. Oscar followed, patting softly, his tiny paws barely making a sound. Ellery stood at the threshold for a moment, heart pounding. Something was waiting in here, not something alive, but something unfinished. She moved to the desk and began sifting through the drawers. Most of it was mundane, old receipts, letters, postcards never sent. But tucked beneath a false bottom in the largest drawer was a manila envelope. Inside were photographs, grainy, black and white images of Colton as a young man, holding a baby. Not a cousin, not a friend, his son, Maverick. The baby had Colton's eyes. One photo was labeled on the back in messy handwriting. The only good thing I ever did. Ellery sank into the chair, hands shaking. Riley sat beside her, leaning his head on her knee. She looked down at the dog's face, so aware, so present, and whispered, "You knew, all this time." It was becoming painfully clear. Colton had kept his past buried, even from the people who cared about him most. But Riley had lived it. He had carried that silence for years. And now, with Oscar in his care, it was like watching history try to heal itself. A knock at the door startled her. She rushed to answer it and found Tessa Holloway, a retired local journalist who had once interviewed Colton for a small-town history piece. "I heard you've been asking about Maverick," Tessa said, holding a dusty leather binder. "You're not the only one who thought Colton had secrets." She handed Ellery the binder and gave a knowing nod before walking away. Inside were clippings, articles about missing persons, a fire investigation, and a small mention of a child who was never found. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Ellery returned to the study with the binder in hand. Riley and Oscar remained by the desk, unmoving, as if guarding the past. The air felt charged, full of echoes. Ellery looked at the scattered pieces around her and realized they were close, closer than ever. But the truth didn't just live in papers or memories. It lived in the silence Riley had carried for years, and in the tiny heartbeat of the kitten he refused to let go. The following day, clouds rolled in again, covering the sky in thick gray layers. Ellery barely noticed. She sat on the floor of Colton's study, surrounded by photographs, documents, and Tessa Holloway's binder. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep, but she couldn't stop. Every page revealed another breadcrumb. A medical record showed that Maverick had once brought an infant, unnamed, to the county clinic for treatment of smoke inhalation, dated 1 week before the fire. It was Oscar. It had to be. And somehow, instead of being claimed, he vanished into the system or out of it. Riley grew more anxious by the hour. He paced between rooms, sniffed corners, barked softly at shadows Ellery couldn't see. At one point, he stood in front of the fireplace and whined, pawing at the floor. Ellery approached and noticed something odd. The floorboard beneath the hearth was a different color. She grabbed a screwdriver and pried it up. Below was a small, hidden compartment, lined with old cloth and the faint scent of smoke. Inside it, a tiny, charred baby shoe and a letter in a sealed plastic bag. She opened it with trembling fingers. The letter was written by Colton. The handwriting was tight, uneven. "If you're reading this, it means the past has caught up. His name was Maverick Shaw. He found me when he was 18. Said he didn't hate me, just wanted to know where he came from. I couldn't give him much, but I gave him shelter. For a while he stayed. He brought the baby to visit. Said the mother was gone, that he didn't know how to raise a child. I tried to help, but I failed him, just like I failed everyone else." Ellery's eyes filled with tears. The next lines were even more haunting. "The night of the fire, he called me. Said he was scared. Said someone had been following him. I told him to come here. He never made it. But the baby, somehow I think he did. I think Riley heard him crying in the woods. And he brought him here." Ellery looked at Riley, who sat now beside Oscar, watching her with sad, old eyes. The truth was overwhelming. Oscar wasn't just a kitten to Riley, he was a link, a final thread to the only family Colton had left. Somehow Riley had recognized that. Somehow he had known. Ellery clutched the letter to her chest. This wasn't just about solving a mystery. It was about honoring a life never truly lived. About bringing peace to the ones who had carried guilt in silence. That night, as lightning flickered in the distance and the wind howled low, Ellery made a decision. She would track down any remaining trace of Maverick's life. She would find out who had been following him. She owed that to Colton, to Riley, and to Oscar, whose soft purring beneath the fireplace was a whisper from a life nearly lost, now asking to be seen. The next morning, Ellery sat at her kitchen table with the letter from Colton spread out in front of her, a steaming cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. The line that haunted her most was simple. He said someone had been following him. That wasn't just fear, it was a warning. A sign that Maverick's death wasn't an accident. She opened her laptop and searched public records, trying to find anyone connected to Maverick in his final months. One name kept coming up in fragments. Maverick had filed a restraining order, but it was never processed. The person's name was blacked out, sealed. Frustrated but determined, Ellery called Silas Drayton again. He sounded weary, like he had already guessed she would find something dark. "There was a man," Silas finally said. "Name was Grant Beecham. a former foster brother of Maverick's from one of the earlier homes. Trouble followed him everywhere. Drugs, theft, abuse allegations. I remember hearing whispers years ago that Maverick had testified against him. There was a pause. If anyone had reason to come after him later, it would have been Grant. Ellery's hands trembled slightly. She looked over at Riley, who was lying beside Oscar on a blanket near the fireplace. The kitten had grown stronger over the past few days. His eyes more alert, his movements more stable. Riley, on the other hand, looked increasingly exhausted. His loyalty to Oscar was absolute, but the emotional weight was clearly taking a toll. He barely responded when Ellery knelt down to stroke his head. His eyes met hers with something deeper than sadness. As if he, too, understood that danger was no longer in the past. It was approaching. That night, a truck drove slowly past the cabin, its headlights off. Ellery watched from the kitchen window, her breath catching. She didn't recognize the vehicle, but it didn't matter. Out here, people didn't just pass through. She quickly shut off the lights and locked the doors, her heart pounding. Riley stood up suddenly, ears perked, growling low in his throat. Oscar hissed from under the table, a sound Ellery had never heard from him before. Something in the air had shifted. She waited for hours, clutching the old shotgun Colton kept behind the pantry. But the truck didn't return. The silence afterward was worse than the threat, because it meant whoever it was now knew where to find them. Ellery barely slept that night, her mind racing with questions. What had Maverick discovered before he died? Was it really just revenge? Or was there something bigger? Something Colton had hidden so deeply, even Riley hadn't wanted to remember? By morning, the clouds had broken, but the tension lingered like fog. Riley didn't leave Oscar's side. He barely ate. Ellery made up her mind. She would go to the trailer where Maverick had lived before the fire. She needed to see it for herself, because the truth wasn't buried in papers anymore. It was coming to them, and they had to be ready. The road to Maverick's last known address was rough and overgrown, as if the earth itself had tried to forget what happened there. Ellery parked just outside the remains of the trailer site, little more than a charred concrete foundation surrounded by weeds. The air smelled faintly of soot, even after all this time. She stepped carefully around the rubble, heart heavy with each footstep. There was no police tape, no signs of investigation. Just ruin, forgotten, erased. She crouched near what once had been a hallway. Melted metal frames and fragments of scorched furniture littered the space. But what caught her eye was something half-buried beneath a collapsed cabinet. A scorched metal tag, bent and blackened. Ellery picked it up and turned it over. It was a pet ID tag, faded but legible. It read, "Riley if found, call Colton Reyes." Her chest tightened. Riley had been here, at the trailer. Somehow Colton had sent him, or maybe Riley had come on his own, guided by instinct or memory or love. Back at the cabin, Oscar whimpered loudly for the first time since the day he was found. Riley stirred, restless, pacing back and forth by the door. Ellery arrived just before dusk and rushed inside, holding the ID tag in her hand. Riley's ears shot up the moment she entered. She knelt and showed it to him. He sniffed it, then let out a long, low whine that sounded almost human. He curled protectively around Oscar, as if afraid he might lose him all over again. That night, Ellery sat by the fire, reading over the last few documents in Tessa's binder. One name came up again, Grant Beecham. He had been in town just a month before Maverick died. A witness statement said he'd threatened someone at a gas station over unfinished business. The statement was vague, but the location matched the road just a few miles from the trailer. She felt her blood go cold. He was circling them back then, and now he might be circling again. Suddenly, Riley stood up and barked sharply, bolting to the door. Ellery grabbed a flashlight and peered through the window. A figure moved between the trees, just beyond the reach of the light. Too far to identify, too close to ignore. Oscar hissed again and crawled under the couch. Riley growled deep and low, his fur bristling. Ellery's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just memory anymore. It was presence. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. Ellery locked every door and loaded Colton's shotgun again. She knew what she had to do. Whatever secrets Colton had tried to take to the grave were no longer hidden. Riley had carried the memory. Oscar had carried the bloodline. And Ellery, she was now the only one left who could protect them both from what was coming next. The morning came with thick fog and an eerie silence. Even the birds seemed to hold back their songs. Ellery hadn't slept. She sat at the kitchen table, her eyes fixed on the ID tag she'd recovered from the ashes. Riley was curled tightly around Oscar, but both were restless. Something was coming, and they all felt it. She loaded Colton's shotgun again, checked the locks twice, and placed a phone call to Silas. "If I don't call you back by noon," she said, her voice steady, "send someone." An hour later, the knock came. Not loud, not urgent, just steady. Ellery looked through the peephole and felt her stomach twist. A tall man in a tattered denim jacket stood outside, hands in his pockets, face weathered and hollow-eyed. Grant Beecham. She recognized him instantly from the photo Silas had sent her. She opened the door slowly but kept the shotgun visible at her side. "Looking for someone?" she asked, keeping her voice calm. Grant tilted his head. "You have him," he said. "The kitten." Ellery's grip tightened. "Why do you care?" she asked. Grant's eyes flicked past her, toward the living room. "He's not yours," he said. "Never was. But he was supposed to be insurance. Something Maverick owed me." His voice was dry, emotionless. He ran from something he couldn't escape. Thought hiding the kid would fix it. Ellery's heart pounded. "So you came to finish what he started?" she said. "You came to silence him, and now the boy?" Grant didn't answer, but the slight movement in his hand said enough. Riley stood now between Ellery and the doorway, teeth bared, growling low and deep. Oscar let out a sharp, terrified cry from the corner. That sound, raw and piercing, broke something in the room. It wasn't just fear. It was memory, pain, loss. And for Riley, it was the moment that turned instinct into action. With no hesitation, the old dog lunged forward, knocking Grant back into the porch. The shotgun slipped from Ellery's grip in the chaos, clattering to the floor. She ran after them, heart in her throat, but it was over in seconds. Grant scrambled up, stunned, blood on his cheek. Riley stood between them like a soldier, unwavering, daring him to take another step. "You should have stayed dead," Grant hissed at the dog, then turned and vanished into the woods. Ellery called the sheriff immediately. Within minutes, help was on the way, but she already knew. Grant would run again, just like before. Later that afternoon, after the deputies had gone and the forest fell quiet again, Ellery sat beside Riley on the porch. He was trembling but proud, head resting on her lap. Oscar, still wide-eyed, nestled close to his side. Ellery stared at the fading trail into the trees. "You saved him again," she whispered, "just like you did the first time." But deep in her chest, she knew it wasn't over yet. One more truth still waited. And Riley, he remembered where it was buried. 2 days passed. The sheriff's office had issued a warrant for Grant Beecham, but he had vanished, just like he always did. Ellery knew he wouldn't come back. Not now. Not after what Riley had done. But the damage he left behind lingered like smoke in the walls. The cabin felt heavy with memory, thick with the things Colton never got to say. Riley slept longer now, curled protectively around Oscar, who seemed to sense the shift in the air. They had made it through the danger, but the final truth still waited to be uncovered. Ellery sat again in Colton's old study, the smell of cedar and ash now strangely comforting. She sorted through one final stack of papers found in a locked drawer. Among them, a folded piece of paper with handwriting shakier than the rest. A letter never sent. It was addressed simply, "To my grandson." Her hands trembled as she read it aloud, softly, her voice breaking. "If you're reading this, then someone loved you enough to find out where you came from. I didn't do right by your father. I failed him and I failed you too. But this dog, Riley, he remembered what I couldn't carry. He protected what I didn't deserve. I hope you'll forgive me one day." Tears welled in Ellery's eyes. She folded the letter gently and placed it inside a small wooden box she found tucked behind the desk. A keepsake Colton had once carved himself. She added the burned baby shoe, the ID tag, and a photo of Maverick holding a smiling infant boy, Oscar. It was all there now. Pain, love, regret, and a legacy only Riley had kept alive. The next morning, Ellery placed the box on a hill just behind the cabin, beneath a lone oak tree where Colton used to sit in the evenings. She buried it softly, placing a flat stone over the earth. Riley sat beside her the entire time, head lowered in silence. Oscar pawed at the soil gently, as if understanding something had been laid to rest. Ellery whispered a quiet goodbye, not just to Colton, but to the years of silence and shame that had haunted him. Weeks passed. The cabin grew brighter. Oscar grew bolder, climbing furniture, chasing leaves, curling in Riley's tail. And Riley, though slower now, seemed lighter. He no longer sat by the door, waiting for ghosts. He lay in the sunlight, eyes closed, a peace on his face that Ellery hadn't seen since Colton was alive. For the first time in years, the past didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a story that had finally found its ending. One evening, Ellery sat on the porch with Riley by her side and Oscar purring in her lap. She looked out over the trees and smiled softly. "You kept the truth alive," she whispered to Riley. "You gave him a future." And in that moment, beneath the setting sun, she knew. Some heroes don't wear uniforms. Some walk on four legs and carry the memory of everything we've lost, until we're strong enough to remember it ourselves.